Hello, my name is Steve Atkinson, and I will be reading from the book Flora and Ulysses by Kate DiCamillo for 1Book2Schools. Chapter 9, The Whole World on Fire. She spoke to him, and he understood her. What the girl said was, "Ulysses, come here, Ulysses." And without thinking, he moved toward her. "It's okay," she said, and he believed her. It was astonishing. Everything was astonishing. The setting sun was illuminating each blade of grass. It was reflecting off the girl's glasses, making a halo of light around the girl's round head, setting the whole world on fire. The squirrel thought, when did things become so beautiful? And if it has been this way all along, how is it that I have never noticed before? "Listen to me," said the girl. "My name is Flora, and your name is Ulysses." She put her hand on him, and she picked him up. She cradled him in her left arm. He felt nothing but happiness. Why had he always been so terrified of humans? He couldn't imagine. Actually, he could imagine. There had been that time with the boy and the BB gun. There had truthfully been a lot of incidents with humans, some involving BB guns, some not. And all of them had been violent, terrifying, and soul-destroying. But this was a new life, and he was a changed squirrel. He felt spectacular, strong, smart, capable, and also hungry. He was very, very hungry. Chapter 10, Squirrel Smuggling. Flora's mother was in the kitchen, and she was typing. She wrote on an old typewriter, and when she pounded the keys, the kitchen table shook, and the plates and the shelves rattled, and the silverware in the drawers cried out in a metallic kind of alarm. Flora had decided that this was part of the reason her parents had divorced. Not the noise of the writing, but the writing itself, specifically the writing of romance. Flora's father had said, "I think that your mother is so in love with her books about love that she doesn't love me anymore." And her mother had said, "Ha! Your father is so far off in left field that he wouldn't recognize love if it stood up in soup and sang." Flora had a hard time imagining what love would be doing standing in a bowl of soup and singing. But these were the kind of idiotic words her parents spoke, and they said those words to each other, even though they were pretending that they were talking to Flora. It was all very annoying. "What are you doing?" her mother said to Flora. She was sucking on a Pitzer Pop. It made her words sound rocky and sharp-edged. Her mother used to smoke, and then she stopped. But she still had to have something in her mouth when she typed. So she consumed a lot of Pitzer Pops. This one was orange-flavored because Flora could smell it. "Oh, nothing," said Flora, and she glanced at the squirrel in her arms. "Good," said her mother. She whacked the carriage return on the typewriter without looking up. She kept typing. "Are you still standing there?" her mother asked. She typed some more words, and she hit the carriage return again. "I'm on a deadline here, and it's hard to concentrate with you standing over me, breathing like that." "I could stop breathing," said Flora. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," said her mother. "Go upstairs and wash your hands. We're going to eat soon." "Okay," said Flora. She walked past her mother and into the living room, still carrying Ulysses in the crook of her arm. It didn't seem possible, but it was true. She had smuggled a squirrel into the house. She had done it right under her mother's nose. Well, or behind her back, or something. In the living room at the base of the stairs, the little shepherdess lamp was waiting. A pink-cheeked smirk plastered on her face. Flora hated the little shepherdess. Her mother had bought the lamp with her first royalty check from her first book, On Feathered Wings of Joy, which was the stupidest title for a book that Flora had ever heard of in her life. Her mother had sent away to London for that lamp, and when it arrived, she unpacked it and plugged it in, and then she clapped her hands and said, "Oh, she's so beautiful, isn't she beautiful? I love her with all my heart." Flora's mother never called Flora beautiful. She never said that she loved her with all her heart. Luckily, Flora was a cynic and didn't care whether her mother loved her or not. "I think I will call her Mary Ann," her mother had said. "Mary Ann," said Flora. "You're going to name a lamp?" "Mary Ann, shepherdess to the lost," said her mother. "Who's lost exactly?" said Flora. But her mother hadn't bothered to answer that question. "This," Flora said to the squirrel, "is the little shepherdess. Her name is Mary Ann, and unfortunately, she lives here too." The squirrel considered Mary Ann. Flora narrowed her eyes and stared at the lamp. She knew that it was ridiculous, but sometimes she felt as if Marianne knew something that she didn't know, that the little shepherdess was keeping some dark and terrible secret. "You stupid lamp," said Flora. "Mind your own business and mind your sheep." Actually, that was just one sheep, a tiny lamb curled up at Marianne's pink slippered feet. Flora always wanted to say to that little shepherdess, "If you're such a great shepherdess, where are the rest of your sheep, huh?" "We can just ignore her," said Flora to Ulysses. She turned away from the smug, glowing Marianne and climbed the stairs to her room, holding Ulysses gently, carefully in her arms. He didn't glow, but he was surprisingly warm for someone so small. Chapter 11. A gigantic vat of incandesto. She put Ulysses down on her bed, and he looked even smaller sitting there in the bright overhead light. He also looked pretty bald. "Good grief," said Flora. The squirrel certainly didn't look very heroic, but then neither did the nearsighted, unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper. Ulysses looked up at Flora, and then he looked down at his tail. He seemed relieved to see it. He lowered his nose and he sniffed along the length of it. "I'm hoping that you can understand me," said Flora. The squirrel raised his head and stared at her. "Wow," said Flora. "Great. Well, okay. I can't understand you, and that's a small problem, but we'll figure that out. A way to communicate, okay? Nod at me if you understand what I'm saying, like this." Flora nodded. And Ulysses nodded back. Flora's heart leapt high up in her chest. "I'm going to try to explain what happened to you, okay?" Ulysses nodded his head very fast. And again Flora's heart leapt high up inside of her, and hopefully in a hopeful and extremely uncynical kind of way. She closed her eyes. "Don't hope," she told her heart. "Do not hope, instead observe." "Do not hope, instead observe" was a piece of advice that appeared often in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. And according to Terrible Things, hope sometimes got in the way of action. For instance, if you looked at your elderly Aunt Edith choking on a piece of steak from an all-you-can-eat buffet and you told yourself, "Man, sure hope she's not choking," you would waste several valuable life-saving Heimlich maneuver-performing seconds. "Do not hope, instead observe" were words that Flora, as a cynic, had found useful in the extreme. She repeated them to herself a lot. "Okay," said Flora, and she opened her eyes and she looked at the squirrel. "What happened is that you got vacuumed. And because you got vacuumed, you might have, powers." Ulysses gave her a questioning look. "Do you know what a superhero is?" The squirrel continued to stare at her. "Right," said Flora. "Of course you don't. A superhero is someone with special powers, and he uses those powers to fight the forces of darkness and evil, like Alfred T. Slipper, who is also incandesto." Ulysses blinked several times in a nervous kind of way. "Look," said Flora. She grabbed the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto off of her desk, and she pointed at Alfred in his janitor uniform. "See," she said. "This is Alfred, and he is an unassuming, nearsighted, stuttering janitor who works cleaning the multi-floor offices of the Paxatuakit Life Insurance Company. He lives a quiet life in his studio apartment with only his parakeet Dolores for company." Ulysses looked down at the picture of Alfred and then up at Flora. "Okay," said Flora. "So one day, Alfred makes a tour of the Incandesto cleaning solution factory, and he slips, Alfred T. Slipper, get it, into a gigantic vat of incandesto, and it changes him. And so now, when there is a great crisis, when malfeasance is apparent, Alfred turns himself into..." Flora flipped through the pages of the comic and stopped at a panel that showed the glowing, powerful incandesto. "Incandesto," she said. "See, Alfred T. Slipper becomes a righteous pillar of light, so bright, painfully bright, that the most heinous villain trembles before him and confesses." Flora realized she was shouting the tiniest bit. She looked down at Ulysses, and his eyes were enormous in his small face. Flora tried to sound calm and reasonable, and she lowered her voice. "As incandesto," she said, "Alfred sheds light into the darkest corners of the universe. He can fly. Also, he visits the elderly. And that's what a superhero is. And I think you might be one too. Well, at least I think you have powers, and so far all we know about you is that you're really strong." Ulysses nodded and he puffed out his chest. "Flora," her mother shouted, "get down here. Dinner is ready." "But what else can you do?" said Flora to the squirrel. "And if you truly are a superhero, How will you fight evil?" Ulysses furrowed his brow. Flora bent down and she put her face close to his. "Think about it," she said. "Imagine what we might be able to do." "Flora Belle," her mother shouted. "I can hear you up there talking to yourself. You shouldn't talk to yourself. People will hear you and think that you're strange." "I'm not talking to myself," Flora shouted. "Well, then with whom are you speaking?" "A squirrel." There was a long silence from down below, and then their mother shouted, "That's not funny, Flora Belle. You get down here right now." So chapter 12, The Forces of Evil. When Flora came back upstairs after dinner, she found Ulysses curled up in a tight little ball, sleeping on her pillow. She put out her hand and touched his forehead with one finger. His eyes twitched, but they didn't open. She picked up the pillow and moved it carefully to the foot of the bed, and she changed into her pajamas. She laid down and imagined the words. A superhero squirrel rested at her feet, and so she was not lonely at all, emblazoned on the ceiling above her. "That's exactly right," she said. Before the divorce, before her father had moved out of the house and into an apartment, he had often sat beside her at night and read aloud to her from The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. It was his favorite comic. It always cheered him up to read about Alfred T. Slipper and Dolores. Her father did an excellent parakeet imitation. "Holy baramba," he would say in a voice of Dolores's. "Holy unanticipated occurrences." Holy unanticipated occurrences were what Dolores would say when something truly unexpected and unbelievable was happening, which was basically all the time. Life was pretty exciting when you were Incandesto's parakeet. Flora sat up and looked down at the sleeping squirrel. "Holy unanticipated occurrences," she said. It sounded better when her father said it, though. Not that he said it these days. He didn't say much anything anymore. Her father had always been a sad, quiet man, but since the divorce he had become even sadder and quieter, which was fine with Flora, really, because cynics don't like a lot of chatter. Besides, Alfred T. Slipper was a quiet man, too. For instance, when he was on his tour of the Incandesto manufacturing facility and had fallen into that vat of Incandesto, he hadn't said a single word, not even oops. Words had appeared above his head, however, and Flora's father had read those words to her so many times that she could recite them by heart. "He is an unassuming janitor, but he will dare to battle the darkness of the universe. Do you doubt him? Do not. Alfred T. Slipper will live to fight the forces of evil. He will become known to the world as Incandesto." Flora lay back down. If that squirrel were in a comic, she thought, what words would have appeared in the space above his head when he was sucked into that vacuum cleaner? "He is an unassuming squirrel." Yep. "But he will soon conquer villains of all stripes. He will defend the defenseless and protect the weak." Ooh, that sounded good, too. "He will become known to the world as Ulysses." Holy bagumba! Anything could happen. Together, she and Ulysses would change the world, or something. "Do not hope, instead observe," Flora whispered to calm herself down. "Just observe the squirrel." And then she fell asleep. Chapter 13, The Typewriter. He woke in darkness and his heart was beating very fast. Something had happened. What was it? He couldn't think. He was too hungry to think. He sat up and looked around the room. He was in a bed, and Flora's feet were in his face. She was snoring. He could see the outline of her round head. Oh, he loved that head. But man, he was hungry. The door to the bedroom was open. Ulysses got off the pillow and went out of the room. He crept along the dark hallway and went down the stairs and past the little shepherdess. The house was dark, but there was a light on in the kitchen. The kitchen. That was exactly where he needed to be. He put his nose up and he sniffed, and he smelled something cheesy. Wonderful. He ran through the living room and the dining room and into the kitchen. He climbed up on the counter, and there it was, a lone cheese puff, perched on the edge of the red Formica countertop. He ate it. It was delicious. Maybe there were more cheese puffs. He opened a cabinet, and yes, there was a big bag with the beautiful word Cheese-O-Mania written in golden script on the front of it. He ate until that bag was empty, and then he burped softly, gratefully, and he looked around the kitchen. "Flora Belle Buckman, get down here, right now!" "Don't call me Flora Belle," Flora muttered, and she opened her eyes. The room was bright with sunlight. She had been dreaming something wonderful. What was it? She had been dreaming about a squirrel in her dream. He was flying with his legs straight out in front of him and his tail straight out behind him. He was a squirrel on his way to save someone. He looked supremely, magnificently heroic. Flora sat up and looked down at her feet. There was Ulysses, sleeping on the pillow. He did look heroic. In fact, he was glowing, just like Incandesto, except oranger. He was extremely orange. "What the heck?" said Flora. She leaned over Ulysses and reached out a finger to touch his ear. She held the finger up to the light. Cheese. He was covered in cheese dust. "Uh-oh," said Flora. "Flora!" her mother shouted. "I'm not kidding. Get down here right now." Flora went down the stairs and past Marianne, whose cheeks were glowing a healthy and disgusting pink. "You stupid lamp," said Flora. "Now," shouted Flora's mother. Flora broke into a trot and she found her mother standing in the kitchen in her bathrobe, staring at the typewriter. "What's this?" her mother said. She pointed to the typewriter. "That's your typewriter," said Flora. She knew that her mother was absent-minded and preoccupied, but this was ridiculous. How could she not recognize her own typewriter? "I know it's my typewriter," said her mother. "I'm talking about the piece of paper in it. I'm talking about the words on the paper." Flora leaned forward and she squinted and she tried to make sense of the word at the top of the page. "Squirtle." "Squirtle?" said Flora out loud. She felt a surge of delight as the zippy idiocy of the word. It was almost as good as a word as tootie. "Keep reading," said her mother. "Squirtle," said Flora again. "I am Ulysses, born anew." "Do you think that's funny?" said her mother. "Not really," said Flora. Her heart was beating very fast in her chest. She felt dizzy. "I have told you to leave this typewriter alone," said her mother. "I didn't," said Flora. "What goes on here is a serious business," said her mother. "I am a professional writer. I am under deadline for this novel. This is no time for hijinks. Plus, you ate a whole bag of cheese puffs." "I did not," said Flora. Her mother pointed at an empty cheese-o-mania bag on the counter, and then she pointed to the typewriter. Flora's mother liked to point at things. "You left cheese dust all over the typewriter. That's disrespectful, and you simply cannot eat a whole bag of cheese puffs. It's not healthy. You'll become stout." "I didn't," said Flora. But then another wave of dizziness came over her. The squirrel could type. How wholly unanticipated occurrences. "I'm sorry," said Flora in a small voice. "Well," said her mother. She raised her finger. She was obviously getting ready to point at something again. Fortunately for us, the doorbell rang. Chapter 15, The Electric Chair. To say that the Buckman doorbell rang would be inaccurate. Something had happened to that bell. The inner workings had become twisted, warped, confused, or so that instead of emitting a pleasant ding or a bong, the doorbell now sent an angry, window-shattering, you guessed the wrong answer on a game show kind of buzz through the Buckman house. To Flora, the doorbell sounded like the electric chair. Not that she had ever heard an electric chair, but she had read about electric chairs in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. That particular installment of the comic had not contained any advice other than it would be best to avoid getting to a place in your life where you might have to face the electric chair and any noises it was capable of making. Flora had found it to be a vaguely threatening and not at all useful issue of Terrible Things. "That's your father," said Flora's mother. "He rings that doorbell to make me feel guilty." The doorbell buzzed and crackled again. "See?" said her mother. Flora didn't see. How could one person ringing a doorbell make another person feel guilty? It was ridiculous. But then just about everything that Flora's mother said or wrote sounded faintly ridiculous to Flora. For example, on Feathered Wings of Joy, since when did joy have feathered wings? "Don't just stand there, Flora Bell. Go open the door. Let him in. He's your father. He's there to see you, not me." The electric chair knell of the doorbell sounded through the house again. "For the love of Pete," said her mother. "What's he doing? Leaning on the thing? Go let him in, would you?" Flora walked slowly through the dining room and into the living room. She shook her head in amazement. Upstairs in her room, there was a squirrel who could lift a vacuum cleaner over his head with one paw. Upstairs in her room, there was a squirrel who could type. Holy bagumba, thought Flora. Things are going to change around here, and we're going to be vanquished villains left and right. She smiled a very large smile. The doorbell gave another outraged sizzle. Flora was still smiling when she unlocked the door and opened it wide. Thanks for listening. Again, that was me, Steve Atkinson, reading for 1Book2Schools. Thank you. Have a good day. How wholly unanticipated occurrences. I'm sorry, said Flora in a small voice. Well, said her mother. She raised her finger. She was obviously getting ready to point at something again. Fortunately for us, the doorbell rang. Chapter 15, The Electric Chair. To say that the Buckman doorbell rang would be inaccurate. Something had happened to that bell. The inner workings had become twisted, warped, confused, or so that instead of emitting a pleasant ding or a bong, the doorbell now sent an angry, window-shattering, you guessed the wrong answer on a game show kind of buzz through the Buckman house. To Flora, the doorbell sounded like the electric chair. Not that she had ever heard an electric chair, but she had read about electric chairs in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. That particular installment of the comic had not contained any advice other than it would be best to avoid getting to a place in your life where you might have to face the electric chair and any noises it was capable of making. Flora had found it to be a vaguely threatening and not at all useful issue of Terrible Things. That's your father, said Flora's mother. He rings that doorbell to make me feel guilty. The doorbell buzzed and crackled again. See, said her mother. Flora didn't see. How could one person ringing a doorbell make another person feel guilty? It was ridiculous. But then just about everything that Flora's mother said or wrote sounded faintly ridiculous to Flora. For example, on Feathered Wings of Joy, since when did joy have feathered wings? Don't just stand there, Flora Belle. Go open the door. Let him in. He's your father. He's there to see you, not me. The electric chair knell of the doorbell sounded through the house again. For the love of Pete, said her mother. What's he doing? Leaning on the thing? Go let him in, would you? Flora walked slowly through the dining room and into the living room. She shook her head in amazement. Upstairs in her room, there was a squirrel who could lift a vacuum cleaner over his head with one paw. Upstairs in her room, there was a squirrel who could type. Holy bagumba, thought Flora. Things are going to change around here, and we're going to be vanquished villains left and right. She smiled a very large smile. The doorbell gave another outraged sizzle. Flora was still smiling when she unlocked the door and opened it wide. Thanks for listening. Again, that was me, Steve Atkinson, reading for 1Book2Schools. Thank you. Have a good day. Right. She smiled a very large smile. The doorbell gave another outraged sizzle. Flora was still smiling when she unlocked the door and opened it wide. Thanks for listening. Again, that was me, Steve Atkinson, reading for 1Book2Schools. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you.